There is a psychological mechanism that Sigmund Freud observed operating in almost every human being he encountered. A mechanism so automatic, so deeply embedded in the psyche, that most people never become aware they're using it. The mechanism is this: when you feel guilty about something, about a choice you made, a desire you have, a part of yourself you can't accept, you project that guilt outward. You find someone to blame. You make them responsible for your suffering, for your limitations, for your failures. And as long as you can keep blaming them, as long as you can keep the guilt externalized, you never have to face the unbearable truth that you are responsible, that you made choices, that you have agency, that the life you're living, the person you've become, the suffering you're experiencing, it's yours. This realization is so threatening, so destabilizing, that most people will do anything to avoid it. They will spend their entire lives blaming their parents, blaming their ex-partners, blaming their circumstances, blaming society, blaming anyone and anything rather than face their own guilt. And Freud understood why, because facing your own guilt means accepting responsibility for your life. And accepting responsibility means you can no longer be a victim. You can no longer tell yourself that your suffering is someone else's fault. You can no longer wait for others to change so that your life can get better. You have to acknowledge that you have the power to choose differently, and that you've been choosing all along, even when your choices were to remain passive, to stay stuck, to avoid discomfort. This is one of the most brutal truths in psychology. The moment you stop blaming others is the moment you have to face your own guilt. And most people are not willing to face it. Most people would rather remain victims, remain stuck, remain suffering, than accept the weight of their own responsibility. Let's start with a fundamental truth about human psychology that Freud articulated clearly. Guilt is one of the most powerful and most unbearable emotions. Guilt is what you feel when you recognize that you've violated your own values, betrayed yourself or others, acted in ways that contradict who you think you are or want to be. Guilt is the psyche's way of signaling that there's a gap between your actions and your conscience. And that gap is excruciating. But here's the thing: most people never consciously experience their guilt. They never sit with it. They never acknowledge it. Because the moment guilt begins to surface, the defense mechanisms activate. And the most common, most powerful defense mechanism is blame. You take the guilty feeling, the recognition that you've done something wrong, that you've made a mistake, that you're responsible for harm, and you project it outward. You make someone else responsible. You make them the villain. You make yourself the victim. Think about the person who cheated in a relationship. The guilt of that betrayal, the recognition that they violated trust and caused harm, is unbearable. So what do? They blame their partner. You weren't giving me what I needed. You pushed me away. You made me feel unloved. By blaming the partner, they avoid facing their own guilt. They avoid acknowledging that they made a choice, that they were responsible for that choice, that they caused harm through their actions. Or think about the person who has remained stuck in a career they hate for 20 years. The guilt of wasting their life, of not pursuing their dreams, of choosing safety over authenticity is unbearable. So what do? They blame their parents for not encouraging them. They blame their partner for needing financial stability. They blame the economy for not providing better opportunities. By blaming external factors, they avoid facing their own guilt. They avoid acknowledging that they made choices every day to stay in that career, that they prioritized comfort over meaning, that they were responsible for their own stagnation. Or think about the person who is emotionally disconnected from their children. The guilt of not being present, of not showing up fully, of failing to give their children what they needed is unbearable. So what do? They blame their own parents for not modeling good parenting. They blame their job for demanding too much time. They blame their children for being difficult. By blaming others, they avoid facing their own guilt. They avoid acknowledging that they made choices about how to prioritize their time and energy, that they could have chosen differently, that they were responsible for the distance in those relationships. Freud saw this pattern everywhere. He saw people constructing elaborate narratives to avoid facing their own guilt. He saw people spending years in therapy blaming their parents, blaming their partners, blaming their circumstances, without ever turning the lens on themselves. He saw people who were so invested in being victims that they would sabotage any attempt to help them take responsibility for their lives. And he understood why. Because facing your own guilt requires you to acknowledge several unbearable truths. First, it requires you to acknowledge that you have hurt people, that your choices, your actions, your failures to act, these things have caused harm. Not because you're a monster, but because you're human and flawed and limited. And acknowledging that you've caused harm is painful. It's much easier to believe that you're the one who's been harmed, that you're the victim in every situation, that others are responsible for the damage. Second, facing your own guilt requires you to acknowledge that you've wasted time, that you've made poor choices, that you've stayed in situations that were harming you because you were afraid to leave, that you've pursued things that meant nothing to you because you were trying to impress others, that you've sacrificed your authentic desires for security or approval, and acknowledging that you've wasted precious years of your life is devastating. It's much easier to blame others for wasting your time, for holding you back, for preventing you from living the life you wanted. Third, facing your own guilt requires you to acknowledge that you could have chosen differently, that you had agency all along, that even when circumstances were difficult, even when options were limited, you still made choices. And if you could have chosen differently, that means you're responsible for where you are. You can't blame fate. You can't blame circumstance. You can't blame others. You made choices, and those choices have consequences, and you have to live with them. This is perhaps the most unbearable truth of all, that your life is yours, that you've been the author all along, even when you were telling yourself you were powerless. Freud understood that most people cannot bear these truths, so they blame. They create narratives where they're the victim and others are the perpetrators. They collect evidence of how others have wronged them. They rehearse the story of their suffering. They find people who will validate their victimhood, and in doing so, they avoid the crushing weight of their own guilt. But here's what Freud also understood. As long as you're blaming others, you remain stuck. Because blame is fundamentally disempowering. When you blame others for your suffering, you give them all the power. You make yourself helpless. You make your well-being dependent on them changing, on them apologizing, on them finally seeing what they did to you. And they probably won't. They probably can't. And even if they do, it won't fix your life. Because your life is not their responsibility. It's yours. When you stop blaming others, when you finally withdraw that projection and turn the lens on yourself, something terrifying happens. You have to face your own guilt. You have to sit with the recognition that you've made mistakes, that you've hurt people, that you've wasted time, that you could have chosen differently. You have to feel the full weight of your responsibility for your life. And that weight is crushing. It can feel like it will destroy you. This is the moment where most people retreat back into blame. The guilt is too much. The responsibility is too heavy. It's easier to go back to the narrative where you're the victim, where others are responsible, where your suffering is not your fault. And Freud saw this happen over and over. He saw people approach the edge of taking responsibility, feel the first wave of guilt, and immediately retreat back into projection and blame. But if you can stay with it, if you can tolerate the guilt without retreating into blame, something remarkable happens. The guilt begins to transform. It stops being an unbearable, crushing weight and starts being information. It starts showing you where you violated your own values, where you've betrayed yourself, where you've acted in ways that contradict who you want to be. And that information, as painful as it is valuable, because it shows you exactly where you need to change. This is the paradox at the heart of Freud's understanding of guilt. The only way to be free from guilt is to face it fully. As long as you're projecting it onto others through blame, as long as you're avoiding it through victimhood, it remains a constant background presence, creating anxiety, depression, and self-sabotage. But when you face it directly, when you acknowledge your responsibility and feel the full weight of your guilt, it can finally be processed. It can finally be integrated, and then it can finally be released. But releasing guilt doesn't mean forgetting what you've done. It doesn't mean excusing yourself or minimizing the harm you've caused. It means acknowledging it fully, taking responsibility for it, and then making different choices going forward. It means accepting that you've made mistakes, that you've hurt people, that you've wasted time, and then asking yourself, what do I do now? How do I live differently? How do I make amends where possible? How do I change my patterns so I don't repeat the same mistakes? This is where guilt becomes transformative rather than just destructive. When you stop blaming others and face your own guilt, you gain access to the possibility of genuine change. Because now you see clearly what you've been doing. You see the patterns, you see the choices, you see where you've been complicit in your own suffering, and you can choose differently. You can acknowledge that you stayed in the job you hated, not because your parents didn't encourage you or because your partner needed stability, but because you were afraid. You were afraid of failure, afraid of uncertainty, afraid of pursuing something meaningful that might not work out. And once you acknowledge that fear, once you take responsibility for letting fear drive your choices, you can start making different choices. You can start taking small steps toward work that matters to you, even if it's risky, even if it's uncertain. You can acknowledge that your emotional disconnection from your children is not because your own parents didn't model good parenting or because your job demands too much, but because you were protecting yourself. You were protecting yourself from the vulnerability of showing up fully, from the possibility of failing as a parent, from the discomfort of your children's needs and emotions. And once you acknowledge that self-protection, once you take responsibility for choosing safety over connection, you can start showing up differently. You can start being present even when it's uncomfortable, even when you don't know what to do. You can acknowledge that you cheated in your relationship not because your partner wasn't meeting your needs, but because you were seeking validation, seeking escape, seeking something to fill an emptiness inside you that your partner could never fill, because it was your responsibility to address. And once you acknowledge that, once you take responsibility for betraying trust instead of doing the internal work, you can start addressing the actual issue. You can start doing the work on yourself rather than expecting someone else to fix what's broken inside you. This is what becomes possible when you stop blaming others and face your own guilt. Not comfort, not the erasure of mistakes, not a clean slate, but clarity, responsibility, the power to choose differently, the possibility of genuine change. But Freud would also tell you that this process is ongoing. It's not something you do once and then you're free forever. The impulse to blame others, to project guilt, to make yourself the victim, this impulse is always there. It's a fundamental defense mechanism. It's how the psyche protects itself from unbearable feelings. So you have to keep returning to the practice of taking responsibility. You have to keep catching yourself when you start to blame others. You have to keep asking, what is my responsibility here? What choices did I make? What could I have done differently? And each time you do this, each time you choose responsibility over blame, you become more integrated, more honest, more powerful. Not powerful in the sense of controlling others or dominating situations, but powerful in the sense of owning your life, of recognizing that you are the author of your existence, that your choices matter, that you have agency even when circumstances are difficult, that you are responsible for how you respond to life, even when you're not responsible for what life brings you. This is psychological maturity. This is what Freud meant by a strong ego, not an ego that's inflated or defended, but an ego that can bear the weight of responsibility, an ego that can face guilt without collapsing into shame or projecting blame onto others, an ego that can acknowledge mistakes and harm without being destroyed by that acknowledgement, an ego that can say, I was responsible for that. I made those choices. I caused that harm, and I can choose differently now. Most people never achieve this. Most people spend their entire lives blaming their parents, blaming their partners, blaming their circumstances, blaming the world. They die having never taken full responsibility for their lives. They die having never faced their own guilt. They die having remained victims, externally controlled, dependent on others changing for their life to improve. They die without ever claiming their power. But the possibility of a different life is always there. The possibility of stopping the blame, the possibility of facing your own guilt, the possibility of acknowledging your responsibility, the possibility of claiming your agency, the possibility of making different choices, the possibility of living as the author of your existence rather than as a victim of circumstance. Freud knew this was possible. He saw people do it. He saw people stop blaming their parents and acknowledge their own choices. He saw people stop blaming their partners and acknowledge their own patterns. He saw people stop blaming circumstances and acknowledge their own agency, and he saw how transformative this was. He saw how people who took responsibility for their lives, who faced their guilt rather than projecting it, who claimed their agency rather than remaining victims, These people transformed, not into perfect beings, not into people without problems, but into people who were genuinely living rather than just reacting, into people who had power over their own lives. The question is whether you're willing to do this. Whether you're willing to stop blaming your parents for how they raised you and acknowledge how you've stayed stuck in those patterns as an adult. Whether you're willing to stop blaming your ex-partner for the relationship's failure and acknowledge your own contributions to the dysfunction. Whether you're willing to stop blaming circumstances for where you are and acknowledge the choices you've made along the way. Whether you're willing to face the guilt of wasted time, of harm caused, of choices you wish you'd made differently. Because until you do this, until you stop blaming others and face your own guilt, you remain powerless. You remain stuck. You remain a victim. You remain externally controlled. You remain waiting for others to change so that your life can improve. You remain telling yourself stories about how you would have lived differently if only others had treated you better, if only circumstances had been different, if only you'd been given what you needed. But when you stop blaming, when you face your guilt, when you take responsibility, everything changes. Not because your past changes, not because the harm you experienced or caused disappears, but because you reclaim your power, you reclaim your agency. You recognize that you are the author of your life, that you always have been, even when you were telling yourself you weren't. You recognize that you can choose differently, that you can change, that you can live differently starting now. When you stop blaming others, you finally face your own guilt. And in facing that guilt, in bearing its weight without projecting it, in acknowledging your responsibility without collapsing into shame, you become free. Not free from the past, not free from consequences, but free from victimhood, free from powerlessness, free from the prison of blame, free to live as yourself, to make your own choices, to create your own life. This is what Freud knew. This is what he spent his career pointing toward. The liberation that comes not from avoiding guilt, but from facing it. The power that comes not from blaming others, but from taking responsibility. The freedom that comes not from remaining a victim, but from claiming authorship of your life. The choice is yours. Keep blaming others and remain stuck in victimhood. Or face your own guilt, bear its weight, acknowledge your responsibility, and finally become the author of your existence. Only one of these paths leads to freedom. Only one leads to power. Only one leads to genuine transformation. Only one leads to living your actual life rather than remaining trapped in stories about why you couldn't. When you stop blaming others, you finally face your own guilt. And that facing, that bearing, that acknowledgement, that's where real life begins.